The ancient Romans were famous for their complex and extremely effective military machine, but whenever we think of the Roman soldiers, or the Roman legionary, perhaps the centurion, are normally the first types of units that come to mind. But throughout its history, the Roman army not only had lots of different types of soldiers, but also types of ranks. Well, today, we'll learn all about it. Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and the first type of Roman soldier that we have mention of within history is the so-called celeres. Now celeres translates as the fast ones, and they were allegedly instituted, according to Dionysios of Halicarnassus' account, by Romulus himself. We're talking about a corps of 300 cavalry or mounted soldiers armed with spears, recruited among the strongest, fittest and most robust young men from illustrious families during the Kingdom of Rome. Their duty was to protect the king in battle. According to Plutarch, the celeres as a corps were disbanded from the second king of Rome, Numa Pompilio, because as a private type of militia under the direct command of the king, they could have given the idea that Roman monarchy, in order to affirm its authority, needed weapons. Now, to have a more complete framing of the archaic Roman military organization, we have to look at the Servian reforms, attributed to King Tullius on the 6th century BC. Mentions of this original Roman army come from two different writers, Dionysios of Halicarnassus and Titus Livius. The so-called Servian phalanx was structured according to the census. In other words, it all depended on how much money you were making. Roman citizens would be divided into 5 classes, armed depending on their economic power. Both writers concur when it comes to the equipment of the first 3 classes. First class, wielding an aspis shield, greaves, cuirass, helmet, spear and sword, so basically a copy of Greek hoplites. Class 2, scutum shield, greaves, helmet, spear and sword. Third class, scutum shield, helmet, spear, sword. Now when it comes to the equipment of the 4th and 5th class, instead the two authors disagree. So let's check that one out. According to Titus Livius, the 4th and 5th class were equipped, one with spears and javelins, and the other with stones and flings, respectively, effectively becoming 2 different types of light infantry. Whereas according to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, the 4th class was still a type of rank and file unit, equipped with shield, sword and spear, while the role of light infantry was only covered by the 5th class, equipped with both javelins and slings. Dionysius also tells us that it was Servius Tullius that instituted the rank of centurion, choosing among the bravest and most courageous combatants to put them at the head of a full century. He also tells us that this is where the army starts to be followed by non-combatants as well. In the 2nd class, we have carpenters and blacksmiths, whom needed to, open quote, craft anything that would be necessary in times of war. And the 4th class would have the field musicians and horn players. Titus Livius instead tells us that Servius Tullius recruited 12 centuries of cavalrymen, for a total of 1,200 armed mounted soldiers, chosen among the Roman nobility, whose horses, however, were bought with public money, and whose maintenance was paid through the institution of a tax that was paid by unmarried women. Now, we don't have specific details when it comes to standard bearers, but at least we know that in the Servian phalanx they had a rank called insignia. From Titus Livius we also learned that it is in the 4th century BC that the Roman army undergoes a substantial evolution of sorts. Compared to the archaic army of Servius Tullius, the role of the centurion becomes an actual officer who now has managerial responsibility on the field. When it comes to tactical groups, this is where the Manipular begins. A Manipular of this time was formed with 2 centuries. Therefore, within it, you had 2 centurions. These will be divided as centurio prior and centurior posterior, so the front centurion and the rear centurion. It is during this time that we have the first differentiation when it comes to equipment of a centurion, in the sense that that's when we see the first helmet with a horizontal crest, so that other soldiers could easily identify their commanding officer on the field. Initially, these crests will be just made by 3 feathers, but they will eventually evolve into a full-on crest. Another characteristic that we notice of the centurion of this time is the fact that they would be the kind of soldier that wears the sword on the left, whereas the rest of the soldiers, or the normal legionaries, would be wearing it on the right, so that when you draw the sword, it doesn't interfere with the shield, forcing you to move the shield out of the way, exposing you to enemy missile fire. The reason why officers would normally wear it on the left is also possible that it was due to an influence of Greek origin, and it was considered to be reminiscent of Greek warfare, which was of course famous at the time. Among all the centurions of an entire legion, a so-called primus pilus would be chosen. He would be the highest ranking centurion within the entirety of the army, and he would be in command of the first century. This would be considered an elite force, and all other centurions would have to refer to him. Already in the 4th century BC, the primus pilus seems to have been also a link officer that would connect the rest of the lower officers with the high commanding officers such as tribunes, consuls, and the dictators. It is in the second half of the 4th century BC that we have the first mentions of the so-called principales, who would be considered to be a sort of non-commissioned officers of the Roman army. It is in 340 BC, as the Romans were getting ready to engage their enemy during the Battle of Vesuvius, the consuls gave each centurion the permission to choose among their men a single combatant that could work and function as their own bodyguards. This is how the rank famously known as the Optio, or the Chosen One, was born. As we look at the iconography, you'll notice that one way to recognize a centurion, instead of an Optio, is by what they are holding. Centurions held a vitis, which was a sort of wooden implement that they would use to chastise lazy soldiers. An Optio would be carrying something called hastile, which was a wooden rod that ended with a spear that was used to keep the ranking soldiers in line. Within the 4th century BC, we also have the birth of the so-called vexillari, or standard bearers that were also considered non-commissioned officers. They would be carrying the vexillum, which was part of the military insignia of the legion. Livius tells us that they had one per manipul. Now, when it comes to Republican Rome, it's unfortunately really difficult to have a very detailed description of all of military insignia. Roles that had to do with music on the battlefield, even though we can't pinpoint the specific date, we do know that it is in the 4th century BC that music performers or players, such as the cornicines, tubicines, and bucinatores, stopped being recruited from the low classes based on the census, possibly even as non-commissioned officers, since they began to feel an actual more practical and functional duty within the army. Both the signifers and the musicians are now starting to impart visual orders for the rest of the troops under the command of the centurions. The reforms of the 4th century don't only have to do with officers, however, but with the very structure of the legion itself. Soldiers now are not divided in corps based on their census, but based on their age, so that you would have the first lines with the youngest soldiers and the reserves having more mature men. The army now is divided into 3 different types of soldiers: the hastati and principes, who were collectively referred to as the antipilani, literally those in front of the pilani, and of course the pilani, who were more commonly known as triari. The hastati, who were deployed in the first ranks of the army, were young, strong soldiers, and each of their manipules was also accompanied by 20 leves, a type of light infantry or support unit equipped with spears and javelins. The princeps were instead ranks of more experienced or veteran soldiers. Behind the princeps you have the triari. The triari were the most veteran warriors, not as young, but very experienced. An interesting thing you might not know is that they were deployed differently from the rest. They wouldn't be standing, but they would be crouching, as to reserve their energies, waiting for their time to join the battle. Following, we had 2 corps of reserves, the rorari and the accensi. The rorari were considered to be less valuable, both due to their experience and age, whereas the accensi were the least valuable of all soldiers and therefore were placed in the rear. Apart from the leves, we don't unfortunately have a detailed description of the equipment of each single corps, and to learn more about it we have to read Polybius, even though we have to consider that whatever he wrote, well, he wrote it in the 2nd century BC, so a couple of centuries after. The hastatus, apart from the helmet, shin guard, scutum, armor and sword, were equipped with 2 javelins, or pila. The princeps had an analogous equipment, even though from a passage by Dionysius we could suppose that at the beginning of the 4th century, instead of having javelets or pila, they were actually carrying a spear, and only afterwards ditched it for javelins. And therefore, when it comes to princeps, Titus Livius tells us that in general their armament was the best. So we have to imagine that they had more protective armor if compared to the hastati. It would have been more common to see them wearing a full-on lorica hamata, particularly after the contacts with the Gallic world, whereas the hastati would have been more commonly wearing the spongia pectoris. When it comes to the triari, as long as they existed as a corps, they never used javelins, but are always equipped with spears. Even though these were less formidable than the hastati and the princeps, the triari were still considered to be an honorable corps, because their job was to enter the battlefield to help if the situation wasn't going as planned. Differently, Rorari and Akensi are considered to be low-quality, infamous troops that rarely enter the field, and when they do, they're usually used to fill in openings in the ranks, sometimes just picking out the weapons of the deceased. Considering the fact that they would have been recruited from the low class, we could say that they are sort of the period version of the ancient 4th and 5th class. During the Second Punic War, the battles against the Carthaginian troops recruited in Spain puts the Romans in contact with the gladius, which becomes their sword of choice, used by all combatants in the legion. Moreover, under the pressure of the multiple skirmish troops, light infantry and ranks of the army of Hannibal, we are told the Romans respond by unifying the Rorari and the Akensi into one specialized corps, the Velites, creating a unit of light infantry which was numerous and equipped with javelins, swords, and parmula shields, a small round shield. We are also told by Polybius that the Velites would decorate their helmet with wolf, fox, and other animals' fur. Each manipul of this time is accompanied by a force of 40 Velites, doubling the number of specialized light infantry of previous times that would normally be assigned to the hastati troops. Polybius also tells us that during the Second Punic War, each manipul had 2 signifiers. Due to the fact that one of Hannibal's tactics was to use espionage against the Roman army, it is during this time that a new type of non-commissioned officers enters the scene, the tesserarius. Each manipul had its own tesserarius. At the end of the day, while during March the army would camp, the tesserarius every single day would go to the tribune's tent. 1 tesserarius from the hastati, 1 from the princeps, 1 from the triari. Here, the 3 tesserari would receive a wooden tablet called tessera, where the password to enter and exit the camp would be written on. The military reforms of Gaius Marius are probably some of the most important throughout the history of the Roman army. These occurred in 107 BC. The army becomes unified, the soldiers' equipment more uniform. The triple division of hastati, princeps and triari disappears. They're all called legionaries and they become a heavy infantry citizen corps, armed with helmet, all sorts of different types of armor, scutum, sword, pilum. Velites are now called antesignani, so those who stay in front of the insignia. Varro and Festo also tell us that by order of Gaius Marius, in order to increase their defense capabilities, their small shield is substituted with a shield brectio, a shield similar to that used by the rest of the legionaries, but flat and slightly smaller. It is during the Marian reforms that we have the beginning of a new specialized type of signifer, the aquilifer. Marius also introduces the new tactical corps called the cohort, which was made of 480 soldiers, replacing the manipuls. The aquilifer becoming the most important type of signifer as he was carrying the eagle, the symbol of the entire legion. During the Marian reforms, we also have the beginning of 2 new categories of legionaries, namely immunes and beneficiari. The immunes were legionaries that were exempt from heavy-duty tasks, digging of trenches, because of their specialized skills, such as smiths or carpenters, but also engineers, hunters, war machine crew, artillery crew, accountants, and weapon maintenance specialists. If one of the immunes was particularly good at his job, he would become a beneficiarius. Differently from the rest of the immunes, who were simple soldiers, the beneficiari were principales, so non-commissioned officers. They had to take care of administrative, policing and logistical jobs. Generally speaking, coordinating the munus. The Imperial era, with the increase and evolution of the Roman military machine, brings to pass the birth of 4 more types of principales. The campi doctor, a type of centurion that had the duty of training the troops for combat. The medicus, an officer who was well versed in the medical arts and had the duty of healing and mending the wounds of the soldiers. This sort of task before the creation of the medicus would be carried out by the munus. Then the imaginifer, a new type of signifer whom was taking into battle an image of the emperor. It is during the Imperial age that signifers start wearing particularly big types of fur on top of their helmets, such as bear fur and big feline fur. Last but not least, we have the draconarius, a late Imperial type of signifer carrying a banner called the Draco. Alright, number ones, well, I hope that you enjoyed this introductory video on the military ranks within the Roman army and how it evolved through the ages. If you're interested, I can continue making these videos, perhaps with another episode, discussing the salary and the amount of money that each type of soldiers were making throughout the ages, and perhaps even all the different percentages of cavalry, ranged units, and infantry throughout the ages in the Roman army. If you're interested, let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.